Hello, Marieke. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today and giving a lecture. We are really very thankful. Marieke van Erp is from Netherlands, where she leads digital humanities cluster at the Dutch Academy of Sciences and Arts. She is a prolific researcher with numerous and influential publications in the field of natural language processing. And she's a wonderful scholar, which expands her field of interests to digital heritage and cultural heritage, looking at how metadata is structured in cultural heritage collections. I believe I introduced you right, Marieke, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it's so nice that you have a hybrid setup. So I hope everyone can see my slides. I will also make them available for you afterwards. So yeah, I'd like to say something about something I'm very, very passionate about, and that is really doing interdisciplinary research. Because there are just so many problems that really require the input from different domain experts, but it can be difficult to work together sometimes because research cultures and research fields are just so different. So I'd like to talk a little bit about my experiences and the experiences in the projects I'm working in on research on the intersection of humanities, computer science, and cultural heritage. So we have, especially with cultural heritage, so much amazing data available. So a lot of museums and cultural heritage institutions have been doing a lot of work digitizing their formerly analog records to digitized records that we can query and analyze using big computers. We don't always need big computers because not all the data sets are super big, but sometimes we do. Let's see if I can make sure that everything is visible. There you go. And there's various different challenges that we face when dealing with these things. So there's data challenges. So a lot of computer science tooling is really not created with the kind of data in mind that you get from cultural heritage collections. There are technology challenges, so they're a bit related to the data challenges, but there's also, for example, inherent bias in a lot of technology. A lot of search engines, for example, they are really optimized for finding the most frequent, finding the most popular things. I mean, that's how companies make their money, but our researchers, humanities scholars, they might be actually looking for other things. They're not looking for the most popular, the most frequent thing, but really the nitty-gritty details, or in the case of what we're trying to do in the cultural heritage, in the cultural AI lab, is to find the hidden things in the data sets. And for example, the voices that are less well represented in those data sets. And then there are cultural and user challenges. So we have to, for example, deal with different research cultures. Humanities researchers generally get evaluated, if you will, on books and journal articles, whereas for computer scientists, conference proceedings can be quite important, and journals to a lesser extent, and books, well, we do write some books, but not as many. So we have to deal with those kind of things as well when you work in these kind of settings. So I'd like to talk about two main projects that I am working on. The first one is Ojiropa. It's an EU project that started in January, and the full title is Negotiating Olfactory and Sensory Experiences in Cultural Heritage Practice and Research. And we're basically spread out over 6 different countries. We have 7 different partners, 2 in the UK, 1 here in the Netherlands, 1 in Germany, 1 in Slovenia, 1 in Italy, and 1 in France. And really what we try to do is we want to bring together historians, semantic web researchers, computer vision researchers, natural language processing researchers, museum and heritage science, and we also want to do some policy making. So basically what we have, one of the core goals of the project, I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more, is at the center, we've got the semantic web work package that is led by our colleagues at Euricom in France. So we want to build this big knowledge graph of information about smell that we find in all sorts of archives. For example, coming from images that are processed by our colleagues in Germany, and I will show some examples. For example, from texts. So the images and text, they create input for the semantic web word package. The knowledge graph will actually be used by historians to create these storylines about smells that we find throughout history. So from 1600 to 1925. It's also used by the olfactory heritage science, or the olfactory heritage science work package, which is led by UCL in University College London in the UK. They will also provide information to the knowledge graph in terms of analysis of, like actual analysis of smells using, for example, gas chromatography. And what you get there is really information about the molecular structure of certain smells and certain objects that have smells. And then if we work together with the historians, figuring out which smells are salient, that are significant in European history. So that's all going to be in there. And then we use that. We will actually create a set of smells. We don't know exactly how many, with the input from the historians, with the input from our heritage scientists, to bring to audiences. So these could be smells, if you go to a museum, that you can smell a painting or smell what the situation of the people depicted in the painting could have been. There was an exhibition recently at Mauritshuis in The Hague here, where you could, for example, smell bleach fields in 18th century Netherlands. So people used to put their laundry out to dry in the fields and you could smell the bleach. So some of the paintings, they came with a device where you could stick your nose into it, all very COVID proof. They actually put a lot of time into figuring that out. You could sort of get an experience of what the scenery could have smelled like in that time. And we also want to measure how people respond to that. We think this could be very useful, for example, for visually impaired people, but also for people to engage in a different way with cultural heritage, and especially smells that have often been forgotten or not deemed as important, but they do make up our landscape. I don't know if you travel. Some of the first thing I notice is that it smells differently in different places. And some smells people are really, very protective about them, like the lavender fields in the south of France, and where the perfume industry is, of course, very important. But we would like to argue with the Europa project that smells are important everywhere. And we want to have that conversation with people. So basically what we try to do is we want to trace smells through time. So how is smell expressed in language? How is it represented visually? And to what events and practices is smell linked? So you could think of perfume making, but you could also think of the leather making industry, or industrialization came with a whole smellscape. Well, first this was considered something really, really good, and then at some point people go like, maybe all these industrial smells are not so good for us. So people also started escaping to the country. So that also is connected to what emotions did smells evoke. There's quite some challenges to this. So there is no real measure of smell as there is, for example, for music. So chemists, they can analyze the molecular structure of a smell, but how strong it is, if I'm, for example, looking at the people who are on location in Krasnoyarsk, people who are sitting at front of the lecture room will get a smell earlier than the people sitting farther behind if the smell is coming from, say, the front of the room. And it might have dissolved a little bit because, you know, the molecules spread to the air, and, you know, that happens to music too, but it's much harder to measure with smell. It's also very, very difficult to classify and recognize scents. I think a lot of, I experience that a lot too, but you probably do too. Like you smell something and you're not quite sure what it is. It smells maybe familiar, but you can't put your word to, can't put a phrase to it. And this is also because our smell vocabulary is rather poor. We don't really talk as much about smell as we talk about other things. A lot of the vocabulary that we use for smells is derived from either objects or tastes. So it smells sweet, which is of course also a taste, or it smells like citrus. So we refer to the actual, or maybe the product that it comes from or a similar product. And people have been trying to create these taxonomies for a very, very long time. Carol Linnaeus already tried to create a taxonomy for smell. It's also interesting that certain groups of people, like perfumers, they've developed a jargon, a vocabulary for smell. Winemakers and wine sommeliers have, but and coffee baristas, but they can't really talk to each other about smells because they have independent vocabulary. So there's no universal language of smell. Then also what we sort of see as we are digging into this data, the process we are doing now is that smell is very often discussed in taboo settings. So talk about sexuality or, you know, bodily, body odors and other bodily functions that we don't really talk about in polite conversation, especially now if you go 200 years back. There's also very much sometimes people separate themselves. It's kind of sometimes also racist, like other people smell weird or bad, you know, either people from somewhere else or people who are in a different social class. And I think that, you know, bringing that to the fore again helps us understand smell and the emotions better. But it's thus far been really people doing this manually, so olfactory historians, and we want to bring the computer into that. But it's quite complicated. So we need to think about what kind of information do we want to capture about smells, right? So where does it come from? What kind of situations are involved in it? You can also think of, for example, religious rituals where incense is burned or smoke offerings are made. What kind of people are involved in this? What kind of devices, what kind of artifacts? And the kind of places where this takes place. Some smells are very, very local. If you think of a kitchen, for example, or you think of a church setting. And then, you know, the next level is what are the meanings of these smells and the identities and the storylines that can be associated with it. Probably this, you know, these last three items are going to be probably not going to come out of our information extraction tools, but really in consultation with our historians. There's this interpretation step needed, and that's really where you see that you need to solve this as a team, as a multidisciplinary team. So one of the first things we started with is have our olfactory and our art historians try to communicate how they look at smell. and the kinds of categorizations that have been created in their domain. So our colleagues from the art history side created a nose-first art historical odor wheel. Now, odor wheels have been used quite a lot in the domain of smell. And what you see here, it's probably too small to see, but I'll talk you through it. The inner circle here has descriptions of kinds of smells. So you can have sweet, which is green, you can have spicy, which is gray, you can have industrial, smoky, green, food, or sour. And then in the second circle, we see the kinds of objects that are maybe creating these kinds of smells. So a spicy smell can come from cinnamon. An industrial smell can come from coal or peat. Smoky smells, they come from tobacco, for example, or coffee or vanilla. Then in the third circle, you see the kinds of people, the kinds of objects that in art history and in stories and in, for example, the Bible, that were associated with these kind of smells. So supposedly, unicorns smell of cinnamon. We found several sources that state that. I don't know if the people then actually smelled unicorns, but that's the idea. So then what we have in the final circle, icon class codes that refer to these art historical objects. And so we find a painting of a unicorn that we can thus connect to cinnamon, or a pomander, which was a device that people could carry with them in the early modern period, because this was when people still thought that bad smells caused disease. And if you carried smells with you, then you could ward off the disease. So they would have these, this is a really fancy one. It's made out of metal. If you weren't that rich, you just have maybe a bag. And you could put herbs in it, fragrant herbs, and that you would have on a chain on your belt. You would have a chain that had these, had this on it. Also, what we have is a traditionally Dutch cookie shape. Traditionally, these are made out of wood, and we would make cookies. We still do, especially in autumn, cookies with cinnamon and all kinds of spices. And then we also have some paintings here where people, where spices are depicted. So then the job was in the project to translate this to a semantic web model, a data model that we can use for our knowledge graph. So this slide was borrowed from our my colleagues at the Semantic Web Group. So the choice is made to model smells as events, and we use them. We use a lot from CDOC CRM, but also there is a smell. A smell is generated by a certain object, for example, a rose that emits a smell, and a smell is experienced by a person. And every person experiences a smell differently. Just as some people may be colorblind or see things slightly differently, our noses are all different as well in how sensitive we are to certain smells and how we see those or how we experience those things. So two roses have also different smells. You know, they might be grown in different places and slightly different soil. One had more water than other. I mean, we will have to group things, but initially everything is an individual actor or individual event. Now, if we look at well, how do we then build natural language processing software that actually can do something with this? We take a text example. This is from Vita Sackville West, page 12. They have the old musty smell, which to me, so there's a person experiencing the smell, it would bring back Knoll, which is a place that she used to visit. I suppose it's really the smell of all old houses, so it's a reference to what that smell is like. It's a mixture of woodwork, potpourri, leather, tapestry. So this is really the specifics of that smell, the little camphor bags, etc., etc. So we're currently doing two different things. We have people creating a benchmark, doing the actual annotation, trying to interpret text like this, marking them up, and we're checking how we can put this in a model. So it's quite complicated. So actually the next slide will be talking about this part here, but we have the smell, and there's a smell interaction that took place at Knoll, which currently is a museum, and it's an example of an old house. The smells are created by woodwork, leather, tapestry, camphor bags, the potpourri. The potpourri is composed of lavender and dried rose leaves. Then it's actually the olfactory experience is being had by Vita Sackville West, who writes about this. It would, to me, is the indication. So we also need to look at who wrote the text. It's not everything is in the text. And it's in the 19th century, it's musty. And then we also have, for example, this is one of the practices, the production of potpourri. And dusty and sweet are kind of qualifications of this smell. So we use the inception tool, and this part is led by our colleagues in Italy at Fondazione Bruno Kessler, but we actually are doing this annotation work by people who actually speak the different languages in the project. So we do this for English, Italian, French, German, Slovene, Latin, and Dutch. So our colleagues in Slovenia are tagging some of these texts. In Slovenia, our colleagues in France, and here in the Netherlands, we do the Latin, Dutch, and the German. So we get all these different tags and relationships between those smell-related terms. We basically do the same for paintings, which is led by our colleagues in Germany at Friedrich Alexander Universität. You, for example, have paintings like this. And what is interesting about texts is that there's really not a lot of references to smell, but in paintings, potentially everything is smelly. So the dog has a smell, these flowers have a smell, the lady's feet probably have a smell, or her armpits. This guy here has a smell. So there, in the computer vision task, it's really important to interact and to with the historians to see, well, which are the smells that are significant, that are important. And then what we also look at, for example, here, the lady, she is putting the flowers to her nose. So we're also trying to detect certain gestures. So people putting things close to their nose, or people maybe pinching their nose because something doesn't smell very nice. Well, the way this works is that different objects are detected. So there's a woman who's having an olfactory experience. The dog is smelling something too, we think. The wood is emitting some smell. The flowers are emitting a smell. And there's a gesture involved, it's carrying something to the nose. Now, this is quite experimental. We don't know how far we're going to get in this, but this is basically the ambition we set ourselves. This is the annotation environment that our colleagues in Germany are using to create this benchmark data set. They basically draw boxes around different objects and say, well, this is a flower, this is a dragonfly, this is another flower. And then also we're going to have to see how fine-grained we want to go, because roses are different than lilies, and they might also have a different meaning, but also a different scent. But that's basically where we're at now in the first 9 months of the project. And then this is a picture of Dr. Cecilia Bembibre, one of our olfactory museologists in London. And she is analyzing the smell of old objects, like the molecular structure. So we're also trying to bring that to the knowledge graph as well. So we're already basically, even though we're still in the initial stages, we also want to bring this to audiences as soon as possible. So next month we have our first smell tour opening at Museum Ulm in Germany. So the scents were designed by the International Flavors and Fragrances company that we engaged with in the project to create these smells that go with particular paintings. I haven't, well, this is also something because of the pandemic. It was our people in Amsterdam and England zooming in with the people in Ulm, and they were filming the objects in their collection, yeah, thus trying to communicate this. So when the exhibition opens, it's also going to be the first time that our researchers are going to be actually seeing and smelling the objects together, which, you know, we had not thought of when we started this project. The idea was we just go there and we work with the museum people and we just hang out and look at the depots and all the amazing stuff. But we have to find a way, well, same as with this presentation, I guess. And there's more exhibitions following. So the second part of my presentation, I wanted to talk about the Cultural AI Lab, and some of you are already familiar with it. Ina is actually part of our, on our mailing list, or on our reading group mailing list. So it is a collaboration between various different research institute and cultural heritage institute. So the Rijksmuseum, the Dutch National Library, the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision. But we also want to see if we can, you know, broaden this and have this broader conversation. So our reading group is one way of doing this, where it's run by our PhD students, and they choose a paper every month to discuss via Zoom. So really what we found is that a lot of digital humanities research is kind of one-way traffic. So a humanities researcher wants to, you know, do something computational, then a tool or a computer scientist is brought in, but all that knowledge from the humanities person, that domain knowledge is very often not put back into the AI system. So we want to sort of improve this. So it's about using AI for understanding human culture, and also using the knowledge and expertise from humanities to analyze and improve AI technology. And we also want to go beyond what a lot of tooling does is, you know, work for the majority of the cases. So, but what do you do about dialects, or what do you do about those data points that are less well represented? So a lot of tooling, for example, exploits redundancy, which of course is nice, but what if your data point occurs only once? Then you still want to find that. So some of our colleagues, for example, looked at search engine logs from the National Library to see how often different records were, different documents were returned to users. And 90% of the collection in 1 million search logs just never was never presented to the user. And that's maybe partly because of the kind of searches that people do, but probably also because of some way that the search engines work. Some of the themes we're working on is bias, ethics, also cultural differences, and different perspectives. And this is a conversation that is very much in the spotlight in the Netherlands at the moment, with, for example, museums having the discussion about artworks that they may have received in contentious situations. 2 weeks ago, I think it was decided that one of the museums has to return a Kandinsky back to the family because it was obtained in an auction, but after the Second World War. So there is this big discussion ongoing about and a lot of the museums in the Netherlands, they have colonial pasts. So there's a lot of conversation about that, and we want to contribute to this conversation by looking at these collections, maybe not from the colonizer's perspective, but also from the colonizee's perspective, and what is in those collections that we can help foster this conversation with. This slide is basically how we hoped it would be when we also started this lab. So we've got PhD students and researchers. Actually, we have a lot of young PhD researchers. And the idea was that they would spend time at the academic partners as well as at the cultural heritage partners. And actually, I did this as well during my PhD. It wasn't the Cultural AI Lab, didn't exist yet, but I did a project together with the Natural History Museum. So I spent a couple of days of my week actually in the Natural History Museum in an office, not just in the museum halls, but with the researchers there. And also seeing how museum exhibitions are set up and the research that natural historians do. And then in my project, we try to see how we can make this data that they're all using more accessible. Well, as it turned out, at least the first half year, everyone spent their working days at home, at Zoom. We're now slowly returning a little bit to the office. So I'm actually in the office or in a meeting room in the office right now. But it's still been a bit difficult. We haven't been able to visit the cultural heritage institutions yet because the Dutch government still recommends that everyone work from home as much as they can. So we do try to do close collaborations. So we do have regular meetings with the museum people. We have the reading club, and we hopefully we'll be able to do joint conference and workshop visits. This, for example, at the DH Nordic conference, there is the past couple of years, there was a track called the Twin Talks, where you could only submit a paper if, and the co-authors, there had to be at least one computer scientist and one humanist. And you also had to present together. And that's a format that we think is really valuable and very useful in these kind of collaborations. Also, we have several different partners. We have the core partners who basically start the lab. I mean, we don't necessarily need to grow the lab, but we definitely are also on the lookout for other partners who, for example, have PhD students working on similar ideas, like how can we collaborate? Because there's always more perspectives to investigate in this. There's different layers of bias. This is one of the things that I'm currently working on with my part of the team. So there's bias in the data. Obviously, archives haven't been able to preserve everything, and also choices have been made there that may give some bias, and even the objects themselves have certain bias. The Dutch National Library has digitized 120 million newspaper pages, but of course not everything ends up in the newspaper, or certain things end up on the front page, and other news items only have a very small article. There's bias there that you need to take into account. There might be bias introduced by the tool creators because they look at it from a certain perspective. And there could be technological bias. As you already mentioned, a lot of technology is based on statistics, where certain things just have a higher chance of being, for example, presented to the user in the search engine. So there's also something, a lot to investigate there. And also very, very importantly, we don't want to erase the bias because everything we do has a certain bias as well. But we want to present another perspective on the data, on the tool, and on the interface, so that it becomes more visible and people can make their own decisions on how they want to deal with this. Actually, we're also part of ICAI, which is the Innovation Center for Artificial Intelligence. And it's a basically a big AI ecosystem in the Netherlands. Also, maybe just for your perspective, so this is the Netherlands. To go from the most northern part to the most southern part is a 4-hour drive. So we're looking at a very, very different scale here, which is kind of nice because we can just, well, in normal times go visit each other, and most of the times it's within an hour's or 20-minute train ride or an hour, something like that, and you're there. And there's a very, very diverse group of labs, and most of the labs are actually funded by a company. What happened in the Cultural AI Lab was we didn't have like one company that basically had a big bag of money to fund 5 PhD students, but we basically got all sorts of different research projects going where we could hire the 5 PhD students that were sort of needed to start this lab. But there's a lab with the Dutch police, there's a lab with a supermarket chain, there's a lab with publishers, with chip makers. So also there you really see, all the different faces of AI, and we have monthly meetings there too. We currently have several projects. So we've got the Better Mods project, which is looking at the comment threads in a Dutch online newspaper. We've got the Culturally Aware AI project, which is 2 PhD students. One of them is in my lab at the Digital Humanities lab here in Amsterdam. The other is in another research institute in Amsterdam. CBO, the Social Bias Observatory, is one researcher funded by the Dutch Digital Heritage Network, who's also based here at the Humanities Cluster. And there's the Reframe, funded by the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision, which is the institute is in the Cultural Heritage Institute is in Hilversum. The PhD student is at Utrecht. Then we've got a few more projects upcoming, some funded by the National Library or by the NWO's Dutch Science Foundation. So we are slowly growing, which is very, very nice. So I'd like to highlight one project that we're currently working on. And this is really the people from the Culturally Aware project and CBO. So Valentin works on CBO, and Andrei and Ryan are PhD students on Culturally Aware AI, and Laura and I are some of the supervisors here. And this was a project that was funded by Europeana Tech Challenge. And we really are trying to see, well, we know there are certain terms that we might not want to use anymore today, but how can we detect those terms? So we got to create an annotated data set of what we call contentious terms. So those are terms that may be biased or very insensitive. In English, you could think of the N-word, which 50 years ago was, still commonly used in newspapers, and a lot of people didn't think about it. It was considered normal, but we don't use that term anymore. So the idea is that this could be potentially used to, if we know what kind of context these terms occur in, then maybe we can find some ways of detecting those. semi-automatically, perhaps. So we started off with a set of terms that we got from a publication created by the Netherlands Museum for World Cultures, and they have a research group working on immaterial heritage, and they were investigating, well, you know, what kind of terminology do we have in museum collections that we would probably not use anymore today. So they basically created a word list of certain words that you find in all the older collections, things like exotic. A word like exotic, you sometimes find it in colonial reports talking about particular nations that were visited. These days, you don't want to use that word for people anymore, although you can still use it maybe for vegetables or for plants. So there's also, not all terms are always contentious. Although certain words to refer to particular nations or particular groups of people, they're kind of pretty much always, should always be avoided. So this list called Words Matter, it contains contentious terms, and then also, if there is an alternative available, an alternative term you could use. So we sampled these from the Europeana newspaper collection, which is actually a subset of the Dutch National Library's newspaper collection. So we took random samples, and we basically tried to filter them, also to filter out some OCR errors. And these were presented to annotators. And we actually had several groups of annotators. We first tested this on Cultural AI colleagues. Then we also asked some people here from the Humanities cluster who are, you know, historians or linguists, so they might be a bit more sensitive, a bit more domain experts, you could say. And we used that to fine-tune the task. And then we presented it to a crowdsource on a crowdsourced platform, so to basically crowdsource workers. And this was all in Dutch. So basically we had a term, and then we so gave the sentence and the sentence before and the sentence after it, and we asked people, is this contentious, yes or no? And they also had an option to say, I don't know, or the OCR is so bad, I just can't read it. Basically, the question is, would you use it in an email today? Do you think it's an appropriate term? So we basically, this is basically what I already said. So we had all these, we had about 3,000 unique or extracts, and we used Google Sheets. Ryan, one of our PhD students, did an amazing job at, you know, making sure we could generate all these examples, because a lot of crowdsourcing platforms, they don't really allow you to generate loads and loads of different data sheets. So to set up this task, that was another piece of research in itself. Then we had participants here from the Humanities cluster, and we had about almost 400 participants on the crowdsourcing platform. We did say that we wanted people to speak Dutch, but they could be from everywhere. I mean, we don't know in the individuals, but we do have some demographic statistics, although you also need to, yeah, I'm not sure if all this data is very reliable, because if someone says they're 1 year old and they're doing all these kind of complex tasks, if they can already read it 1 year old, then they're pretty fast. We also put in some control questions. So the expert from Huck, certain samples that they all agreed on were put in as control samples, so we could actually sort of gauge the quality of the crowd workers as well. We paid every crowd worker, I think it amounted to about £12 an hour, but some were faster and some took a bit longer. So but basically the task was done in a few days. We were really worried about that would take long, but these platforms are pretty amazing, at least for our task. We've been analyzing the data the past couple of weeks. So we do, for example, see in the inter-annotator agreement, which is largely done by Andrei Nestorov, that it does seem that the domain experts, they have a higher agreement. So, and they also on average took a bit longer to do the task. So I don't know if that's because they were paying more attention, or maybe they brought in their background. But you can sort of filter out more reliable annotators based on, for example, the control samples and some other statistics. Then the analyses that Valentin was doing, we do find that certain terms are just the best indicator. So basically, certain terms are kind of always contentious, and other terms aren't. In the middle, it's kind of hard. But if you do all sorts of machine learning experiments, the terms basically are the most important feature in that. And then also looking at some context. So Ryan has been working on this. We could, if you do clustering, you can see, for example, that certain contexts really are a good indicator for contentiousness, although the signal is quite weak. Hopefully more about this. Hopefully the dataset will be released soon as well through Europeana. Just a little bit about how we tend to set up these kind of collaborations. And I mentioned it a couple of times. Working from home is not the ideal setup. So we very often, different color post-its are one of my favorite tools to work with, to really get people to think through a problem, have them organize the post-its together. So we had thought of doing a lot of these kind of sessions when we set up Europa and the Cultural AI Lab. It turned out to be a lot of this, as I'm sure you've all been doing as well. One of the things we've been doing with Europa is basically send round smells to people. So this was for a workshop that was organized by the team to interact with museum professionals and get their thoughts on using smells in exhibitions. Like, have you done this before? How do you feel about this? Would you use it? If you've already done it, what are your best practices? So basically, we shipped these smells to everyone. And there's, of course, a lot we learned there too. Sometimes it takes a while for the post to arrive, and some of the smells might have actually disappeared, even if you package them in plastic. Glass seems to be the best way to package them, but that presents other problems with shipping. But what we also notice is that people really like having a non-digital experience with meetings. So this is one way of trying to at least, get a bit away from the Zoom fatigue. So yeah. I wanted to talk about sea voyages as well, but for the interest of time, I removed that slide. But really what we see is that domain expertise is very, very important here. So we really have in the modeling smell, the olfactory and art historians who are actively involved in creating the data model. We also use competency questions a lot in this, and we also in the cultural AI projects, we just have really often talked to the museum people, talked to the curators. Very often as well, we need help in interpreting the data sets. And we also did online workshops with various people there. These problems are just too complicated to just leave to computer scientists. Here are just a few other projects that are currently ongoing at the Digital Humanities Lab. So I do invite you to go have a look at our website, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks a lot for a fascinating talk. Wonderful. Sums up what you have been doing. So thank you. Well, we've been looking forward to questions from.
Yes, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, wonderful lecture. And I was really impressed by your braveness when you say that you didn't, you just exposed the bias for everyone to see, to see it, and to be free to evaluate the bias. But do you know, can you just say something about this elegant ways of showing the bias of your data, not to lose confidence of your users or self-confidence? So,
I mean, this is
I'm
all...
sorry. Maybe I can reformulate,
Okay.
and maybe that will be that will make my question a bit more clear. To what extent do you think the bias in data is acceptable? For example, well, if you just manifest that, okay, we allow bias in the data, we just will not hide it. But actually, if you show a very biased data and you say, okay, this is a very biased data, this is just like a little bit, and just then there will be no sense in it. Yes, so we cannot do with it anything.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is also that so bias has so many different dimensions.
Yes.
Right. So I didn't have a slide on this, but in the Savio project, the Social Bias Observatory, the team has created an interface. So we were actually very lucky to have budget to have an interface developer, Werner Helmich, on this project. And we have an interface where you can basically kind of re-rank the collection objects if you give in a list of terms. And you could put in terms like slavery, colonialism, put in a list, and then you basically see kind of the dimensions of what collection objects score high in relation to these terms. And if you put other kinds of terms in, for example, related to gender, you get another ordering. It's basically snapshots of the collection. I don't think we have figured out a way to say something about the collection as a whole, because then you also have to have a what is bias to you? But it's a very interesting problem. And actually, our tool can be tested during the Goethe Institute's hackathon, which will take place next week, October 1st to October 3rd. They've got loads and loads of other super interesting tasks and challenges. But yeah, if you look up for Goethe Institute hackathon, then there's going to be an opportunity to talk to us.
It's online.
It's an online hackathon, yeah.
Okay.
I'll see if I can paste the link in the chat in a little bit, but I have to find it. So, or I'll send it to the organizers, and maybe they can forward it to you.
Yeah, that's maybe better, because we don't have access to the chat. Actually, we're just watching it from the TV screen.
But I mean, the cultural heritage institutions, they've also been very open and very interested in this, because they also know that that their collections are not perfect, and then if they have better insights into potential gaps or imbalances, then they could also try to do something with this, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
It's rather a problem, continuing your very interesting conversation, a problem of classification of biases, of different forms and structures of perceive, and probably development of this ontology, very subjective. Also, should be something that Well, any other questions? Online.
Yes. Okay. Well, actually, this discussion about biases, well, it's really very interesting. And I would like to continue with the question, because you mentioned that you, different labs, including yours, are working a lot with the AI and different cultural heritage systems, computerized systems involved in AI. What do you think about do we need to make an effort to eliminate biases, to reduce biases in the AI systems, working with for the research, for the cultural heritage and other research? Or do we need to kind of, so is it possible at all?
It's not possible to completely erase bias, but I do think that you can be more mindful about your data selection, about your algorithm selection, maybe also about, it's very hard to correct your own biases, but if you maybe have a diverse team, that could help. I think that we can never fully erase bias, because every data set that you're going to be choosing to work with is going to be a selection of something else, right? And that selection was made with certain design choices, and your experiment, what you're trying to do, has a certain research question that involves certain design choices. No algorithm is perfect, so every algorithm comes with certain design choices. Whether that is bias exactly or limitations of, I think that's also a bit of a gray area. But I think the most important thing is to have this awareness about it, so that instead of making sweeping statements like we have solved NLP, or that you are aware of the fact that, okay, for this problem and for this domain specific data set, yes, we can do X, Y, Z, but for this data set, we haven't looked at it, so we don't know if it actually works like that. And I think that kind of awareness is very important. And also, coming at it from you come at something from a particular research tradition. Some research groups use particular algorithms more than, and another research group uses another type of algorithms more, which will give you different results. And if you're not aware of that, then this might actually, give you problems later on. So, bit of a long answer, but I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marieke, again for your lecture, and we're really happy with this exciting field of research got known to the audience in this part of the world. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.